Now, welcome to this section of the course where I talk about general care and maintenance of your veggie garden. You've probably built one, you're growing in pots, anyway you've started, and the next step is how do you care for your plants and how do you then continue on after the first season. So I'll touch on some of the things that are fundamental, particularly watering, how to create shade if need be, how to feed your plants, feed the food that feeds you essentially, and then finally I'll look at mulching as a topic and why I do and I don't do it in certain situations. I used to get asked in the nursery was how often do I water my plants, and it's a difficult one to answer because it's so dictated by the weather and the environment. So obviously in seasons such as summer you're going to need to water your veggie garden nearly twice a day, in the morning and night, and in winter you might not need to water at all. It is all dependent upon what's happening. I always like to equate it a bit like Heston can boil an egg, for example, and get it looking exactly the same because you can control the environment. When it comes to growing food, you're at the mercy of Mother Nature. So you've really then just got to have a look at your plants and then be able to tell whether or not they require water. The plants will start to wilt and look like they need a drink. So you'll get better at noticing that, and that's something that you can only do through spending time in your own garden, and it comes with experience. Every different type of plant has different watering requirements. Now, the best time to water your plants is first thing in the morning. This allows the plants to take up the moisture first thing in the morning and be able to survive the heat of the day. Now, we all live busy lives, and sometimes we're not able to do that, and you might only be able to water at night. Preferably water in the morning though, because when you tend to water in the evenings, it tends to create more of a damp, humid environment that then becomes susceptible to more plant diseases and pests. If you have a choice, water first thing in the morning. Now then you're probably going to say, why don't you install an automated system? Now you can, and I think they have merit, particularly when you go away. However, I do think sometimes it breeds neglect in the garden, and some of the best moments and most enjoyable time is actually spending time in the garden, and you do that through watering. So I've always recommended to all my clients and customers that they should hand water first and foremost if you've got the time. Then you can set up a simple system if you want, where you can just use a simple timer on your tap and run a sprinkler if need be. But preferably hand water wherever you can. It is also beneficial because you get to know how much water you're using. A great thing to do is to recycle some water. Leave buckets outside when it's raining. Put a bucket in the shower. Use the kids' bath water. Pretty much you could use grey water on the roots of the plants, but I would stay away from using it on the foliage. You want to water for longer, less often. And what I mean by that, if you can water and allow this water to soak into the soil deeper, it's going to encourage the plant to send out roots down deeper. Where if you water just the surface regularly, often, the plant will only keep its roots at the surface. And then what happens is you get this really hot weather and the plant wilts a lot quicker. So ideally, part of your watering regime is to water less often for longer. So you're wanting to encourage the plant to put down deeper roots. Now, shade. It's much easier to create shade than it is light, but in some cases when you get really hot days, you'll want to create some shade for your plants, particularly with the heat spells we can get sometimes, where you get 40-degree days plus. Many of your plants will suffer. So it's pretty easy to create shade, and I'll show you how to do that now. Now, in terms of feeding, we're feeding the soil, which then feeds the plants that feed us. Give it good quality. You want to give it good quality compost. Think about your inputs. Now, I typically will use an organic fertilizer that I can purchase. I've got some here. That is a pelletized form of basically essentially chicken manure, as well as some seaweed solution mixed through it, and it is then turned into pellets. I find that very useful, handy. I can keep it in the shed and use a handful every so often. My general fertilising regime is that I fertilise once a season. So in summer, spring, winter and autumn, I'll give things a fertilise. I'll also, in between turning over soil, I'll sometimes throw in some organic fertiliser as well as compost. So I'm adding compost to the soil, which contains nitrogen, as well as top dressing. In many cases, in these 4 beds that I've got behind me, I won't mulch, I'll actually use compost and top dress instead. And that helps feed the soil. Now, things to look out for. Now, sea salt. You'll see this seaweed extract, but this is probably the most common one that you'll see at the big green shed. Now, this is not a fertiliser, this is a soil conditioner. What it does is it helps the plant take up its nutrients. So use that in conjunction with your fertiliser. Or you can make your own worm tea, which I think does just as good a job, if not better job, than seaweed extract, is just by grabbing some worm castings, worm poo, put it in a sock, then soak that in a watering can and water that onto your plants. The thing to look out for as well, fertiliser bags. Now on each fertiliser is made up of micro and macro elements. Now, I've listed most of them in the show notes, but essentially the 3 main ones that you have are nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. Now, NPK it's called. Now you'll see that listed on all of your fertiliser commercially bought bags, and the N stands for nitrogen, which is responsible for a plant's foliage. So if you want really nice green, luscious, thick foliage, you want a fertiliser that is high in nitrogen. Now often though, when growing fruit and fruit-bearing vegetables, you don't want to give them a high nitrogen fertiliser, because what it does is it doesn't encourage fruit, it just encourages foliage. So a plant will actually only want to reproduce when it's slightly stressed. So if it's got a fertiliser that is high in nitrogen, it's not going to then put out fruit, okay? So you don't want to over-fertilise either in that situation. You then got phosphorus, okay? Now phosphorus is responsible for a plant's root growth. Your rooting vegetables such as carrot and beetroot all benefit from a fertiliser that is high in phosphorus. And the third and final one is potassium, the K. Okay, now potassium is responsible for the flowers and the production of flowers. So if you've got a fruit tree, such as citrus, or you've got a tomato plant, you're going to want a fertiliser that is high in potassium. Now you can also just buy potash, which is potassium, and water that on your fruiting plants as well. They'll also list on the back of the bag all the micronutrients. So you've got things such as calcium, magnesium, iron, and they'll all be listed as well on the back of the packet. So look out for that in store. And finally, mulching. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I don't like to mulch my vegetable beds, and some people think I'm a bit crazy or that's not the go, but this is the thing with gardening. It's your garden, you can do what you like, and you'll end up finding things that suit you and your gardening style. I don't like to do it because I prefer to top dress with compost and use that as a bit of a mulch, but I also like to go through and hand weed to keep on top of it. Mulch is used essentially to suppress weeds and also retain moisture, and in some cases, particularly where I live, where it's very high in rainfall, I don't always want soggy soil, so I won't use mulch in that situation. Mulch is great during the summer months where it can actually stop the sun from hitting the soil and evaporating that moisture out. The other thing with mulch is that it helps suppress the weeds. So they're the two benefits. I tend to use a sugarcane mulch often because of where I live. There's sugarcane farms around here, so I can easily and readily get it. However, if I had a preference, I would use pea straw or lucerne because that's higher in nitrogen, so it's feeding the soil as it's starting to decompose. They're probably the 4 things that you need to do in terms of just general maintenance. So now at the change of seasons, I've had some beans in this bed, and all I've done is I've actually just dug them back straight into the soil. I'm using that green nitrogen rich material to help feed the soil. I'd only ever remove it if it was diseased, but it was perfectly fine, so I'm going to dig that back through. I'm going to let it sit there for a week or so. I'm also going to probably add next some compost as well as probably a couple of handfuls of organic fertilizer, and then I'll test it to see what the pH level's like, and then I'll grow into it, and then I'll repeat the process. I've set up here a 4-bed system so I can then do crop rotation. The other thing that I tend to do a lot of is I'll just cut and drop a lot of it, so I'll leave the roots in the soil wherever possible. So I won't yank out my lettuce, for example. I'll cut them at the base and leave the roots in the soil. I guess beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but what I tend to typically do is leave a lot of my plants go to seed if possible. By encouraging flowering, it encourages other beneficial insects, which then encourages diversity. And that's the thing I'm going to talk about next or later on, is about pest management